So let me tell you who Yolonda Wilson is, a very impressive woman. Dr. Yolonda Wilson has been a National Humanities Center and Encore Public Voices Fellow. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is a professor at Howard University. Her research interests include bioethics, social and political philosophy, race theory, and feminist philosophy. She's interested in the state's obligations to rectify historic and continuing injustice, particularly in the realm of healthcare and racial justice at the end of life. Dr. Wilson's working monograph, Black Death, Racial Justice, Priority Setting, and Care at the End of Life, is a detailed philosophical study of end-of-life issues affecting African Americans. Additionally, Professor Wilson's public scholarship has appeared in the Hastings Center's Bioethics Forum and The Conversation, and has been republished in the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, Salon.com, and the Philly Voice. Her article for The Conversation, Why Black Women's Experiences of Me Too Are Different, was republished internationally and forms the basis for an edited volume on feminist philosophy and Me Too. Her media appearances include outlets such as Al Jazeera English and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's radio. Yolonda, very excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we could connect.
So to start off, I want to find out a little bit about you as a person. Can you give us a feel for your childhood, where you come from, your background, and what inspired you to be who you are now? I have this picture of my mind that you know, you were stealing glances at Camus behind the soccer backstop and suddenly decided, I'm going to be a philosopher and a sociologist.
That is so funny. So that's a huge question. So actually that isn't quite how it happened. I am from a smallish town in Georgia called Albany, Georgia. It's about 90 plus miles north of Tallahassee, Florida. So I'm definitely a kind of South Georgia, Southern girl. My mother was, she's retired now. So she was a professor of nursing. My father was a college administrator. So I grew up on a college campus. The local college down there is called Albany State. So I grew up on that campus. And it's funny because, you know, their buildings happen to be next to one another. And so I would just kind of go back and forth. And, you know, I would spend a lot of time in the nursing building. And funnily enough, my mother, sometimes when her students needed a child to practice on, you know, to do peds injections or whatever. So I was an abused child. I was like an injection patient. I was like, you know, just whenever they needed a kid, I was the kid, right? And people would ask me all the time, are you going to, you know, be a nurse like your mother? And I was like, oh my God, no, there's no way in the world I want anything to do with anything healthcare. And so it's so funny that, that I'm here doing bioethics. And so I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And so when I went to college, I went to, you know, I was a poli-sci major and I was going to do all this pre-law stuff. And even when I went to get my PhD in philosophy, I thought I'm going to do a joint degree. And so I took some courses over in the law school. And so it's just so funny how, you know, as much as we try to escape our parents, sometimes we end up in the very place, because I found as I was thinking about social and political philosophy and questions about justice, that questions around social determinants of health kept coming up in the literature and my research. And I found myself just kind of drawn more and more and more to those questions. And so that's sort of how I ended up here. There was no real plan. I'm not one of those people who, you know, had a life plan from the time that I was 8. I actually wanted to be a cheerleader for the Dallas Cowboys. That was my life plan. That was
it's a little different. This
path. Very different. So no, I was not reading Camus behind the bleachers.
So you did your undergraduate work at Howard University, and now you're a professor there. Can you talk about what it's like to be back at your alma mater teaching young people, and is there a difference between what you saw as a student and what you see now on campus?
So, of course, as a faculty member, you see behind the curtain. And so that some of the luster comes off of the university, all the things that were just kind of fun that you couldn't figure out. Now you have to think about, budgets and administrations and personalities in a different way. I absolutely, what's also interesting is that some of my old professors are still on campus. And so, some of that's good. Some of that is, sometimes they still treat you like a kid, but one thing that I really enjoy are my students, and in a way it becomes a fun point of connection that I lived in the same dorms that they're living in, that, I really get what homecoming is, not just intellectually, although there's no homecoming this year for anyone, but, so in a way that point of connection is fun for me. And I love seeing, where students are now, where my university has moved in terms of how students are thinking and stuff that they're interested in. So that part of it is a lot of fun.
I want to talk about that part because obviously Howard University, it's historic Black university, has played a big role in the civil rights movement, and a couple of minor people have come out of there: Toni Morrison, Thurgood Marshall, Elijah Cummings, Chadwick Boseman, Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, yes.
You, what's that like? Do you and your students feel a little bit of the burden of history? Do you feel like you owe something to that legacy of what all of that means at Howard?
I mean, I think there's a bit of that. I also think it becomes a source of immense pride for everyone. And in fact, my mother teases me, or she used to tease me when I was an undergrad, and she would come to campus and she'd say, do they just give the freshmen a list so that you all just rattle off all of these names? You can just say, oh, Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack and Felicia Rashad and Debbie Allen, that we can just, and then, when you think even more broadly about, faculty affiliations, now you're talking about Ralph Bunche and E. Franklin Frazier and Elaine Locke and Charles Drew. So she teases me quite a bit about the kind of way that Howard people are into Howard legacy.
And in terms of activism and what's going on now, does that take a place strongly on the campus now? I mean, obviously it's a different environment now with classes being virtual, and obviously everything is different this year than it was last year. But does that show up in terms of the legacy? I mean, Stokely Carmichael, it's some of the more radical elements of Black power. Does that show up in the type of student that goes to Howard University? And is that part of the reason you went there too?
I think it does show up in the type of student who goes there. I think that I'm trying to remember, you've got me thinking back a few years now. I don't remember how much of that. I do think that legacy played a part for me. I also think it's, the geographical location of being in Washington, D.C. Since I wanted to be a lawyer and I thought I was going to go into the Foreign Service and do all these other things, being in D.C. was just, it made sense. And of course, the energy is different now because the students on campus, but certainly in other circumstances, in what feels like worlds ago, the students are regularly not just active on campus in terms of social justice issues, but have no qualms about going down to the Supreme Court, going down to the Department of Justice, going down to the White House. And in fact, a few years ago, Barack Obama gave the commencement address. I think was it 2016? I don't remember.
2016, yeah.
They all start running together when you go to every one. But, he kind of opened and jokingly kind of said, hey, I hear that you all showed up at my house on election night. And it's true. The students will go marching down to the White House in a heartbeat over things. And there was certainly excitement in 2012 when Obama was reelected.
Yeah, it was an amazing time. Oh, those were the days. So in the last couple of years, you have been a National Humanities Center Fellow. You've been an Encore Public Voices Fellow. Can you talk about what those experiences have done for you? What you did, what it was like, and how it's changed your perception and your work?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So, the National Humanities Center is probably the single most important humanities institute in the country, and it's one of the most significant in the world. And so I was there. I was actually a fellow last year at the same time that I was an Encore Public Voices Fellow. So I definitely have a tendency to overcommit myself. But one thing that was kind of interesting about having both of those fellowships simultaneously is that I'm currently, as you mentioned in the bio, working on a monograph on racial disparities in end-of-life care. And the Humanities Center, the focus is much more kind of traditionally scholarly endeavors. And so that was where I was, in residence in Durham, North Carolina, spending the bulk of my time. The Encore Public Voices Fellowship is, of course, interested in scholarly endeavors, but also interested in these very public ways that we think and, share our voices and ideas with the general public. And so what was interesting for me as, the kind of scholar that I imagine myself to be, was having this opportunity to think about my project in these ways that are very traditional, and at the same time, think in really concrete ways about how to talk about end-of-life care issues, about caregiving, about trust in the medical system. And, as I wouldn't call it luck, fate would have it, we ended up in the middle of a global pandemic. And so in some way, both of my fellowships ended kind of abruptly. I mean, in actuality, they kind of shifted to virtual, but certainly the Humanities Center one, where I literally, packed up my house and moved to Durham, that was incredibly crushing to see that aspect of it go away, because part of the beauty of that fellowship is being in residence with other scholars and being able to eat lunch together and having drinks together. And so that part of it was harder to recreate online.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that too. Because obviously COVID-19 and what you're laser focused on looking at must have been also an interesting time. I want to talk first about bioethics. I must admit, I had to kind of sort of look it up online. Can you talk about what bioethics is and how you apply it to the issues that you're most interested in?
So I'll just say very roughly, bioethics is the study of the kind of moral principles, ethical practices and behavior that guide things like healthcare research, biology, medicine, patient care, anything. I'm sorry, I keep fumbling with my earpiece. I think I might just end up taking this one out. I still have the other one in. Yeah, so and the issues that come from that. So end of life care is one, abortion, stem cell research, genetic modification, all of those things, so bioethics can actually be, and it is, a very broad discipline, and people come from different disciplinary backgrounds. So I'm a philosopher by training. There are lawyers who are bioethicists. There are public health people, epidemiologists, physicians, nurses. And in fact, the Department of Bioethics at NIH, where I've also been a visiting scholar a few times, the director of the Department of Bioethics is actually a nurse, Christine Grady, who is also a PhD in philosophy. So she has quite a fascinating background to come into bioethics. And so, yeah, so you have people from lots of different walks of life, even sociologists and historians who are interested in history of medicine or something like that will also think about ethical issues that come out of healthcare, out of global health. For instance, one big issue that we're seeing in the news now is I think everything is all COVID all the time, but among the significant issues that we're thinking about now in the media is around vaccine trials for COVID. You know, who should participate in the trial? Does it make sense to actively solicit some segments of the population to participate in these vaccine trials? What are kind of research obligations to subjects who do participate once we get a vaccine and we're clear that it's safe? Who should get vaccinated first, right? I mean, these are questions of ethics. These are questions of, as I like to tell my students, what we value in society.
Can you talk about you've mentioned the disparities in healthcare and end of life. Can you talk about what that means, both from the aspect of healthcare and end of life itself, and then also the idea of social justice? Because obviously those have to be linked together.
Yeah, so from the healthcare standpoint, I don't think it's a great surprise to your listeners that African Americans tend to live much shorter, sicker lives than their white counterparts, that in Latinx communities, you see similar kinds of numbers. In Native American communities, you see similar kinds of numbers, where you know, there's much more disease progression, much more, there are much more morbidities. In other words, as I like to say colloquially, stuff that's wrong. So chronic illness, and even among other kinds of illnesses that we might think are treatable, or that one can manage, like asthma, you still see these disparities. And a lot of that is connected to the social justice piece. Kind of comes in. I think I'm probably going to end up, you know, going back and forth a little bit. But among the social justice pieces that comes in, some of these seem to be environmental. So who's more likely to live near the toxic waste dump or the landfill or the, you know, that trigger, or the power plant that trigger these kinds of illnesses and ailments? Who is more likely, you know, even what we're seeing now in COVID, who's more likely to have a job where they can't work from home? I think the numbers for African Americans in this country, I think I just saw some information yesterday, only 20% of Black people have jobs that allow us to work from home. And so now, you know, if you're thinking about the importance of sheltering in place, of not being around crowds of people, of being able, of making sure that you're wearing masks and maintaining 6-foot distances, lots of jobs in the service industry don't always allow for that. And so here we're thinking about justice as kind of reflecting the structural reality of the lives that people actually have to live.
And because the pandemic started, you were right in the thick of thinking about these issues. Mm-hmm. I would assume COVID-19, the pandemic, becomes a how-to video on what you're talking about, because the numbers are off the charts, mm-hmm. skewed towards people who are the least likely to be able to battle this pandemic. And you're faced with all kinds of issues, like you said. So what do you see that we can do to educate? One, I assume not many people know about this, and not enough of the right people know about this. And then, do you see that there are solutions to it? One, obviously information, but then what do we do with that information? How do we change this so that people can be safe and have equality of healthcare?
Yeah, so some of this is going to be a matter of public will. And that's just the bottom line. I mean, people can be as well-meaning as they want to be all day long, but you know, for instance, one of the COVID guidelines is around hand washing. If you have significant Native American communities where there's not reliable running water, or there's not, or maybe there's running water, but there's not reliable clean water. I mean, for example, Flint, Michigan is going on how many years without clean water? So this is what I mean when I think about kind of structural injustice. You know, something as simple as hand washing seems obvious if you have a certain amount of privilege and material comfort, but you know, to the extent that stems the spread of the virus, and large swaths of the population in the US don't even have that. I mean, the US is an industrialized nation. We like to imagine ourselves to be a wealthy nation. we have a lot of debt, but aside from that, we like to imagine ourselves to be, a wealthy, industrialized nation. And so the idea that there are significant segments of the population where something like running water or electricity is not a given, is not automatically a given, is a problem. And I know I've talked a lot about communities of color with African-American communities and Native American communities and Latinx communities. There are a lot of poorer white communities that also don't have, reliable electricity and running water. I'm from the rural South. I'm from a part of the South that's, colloquially referred to as the Black Belt, but there are a lot of poor white people where I'm from too. And so, again, some of this is a matter of public will. I mean, I think that, I don't want to get too political here because this isn't a political podcast, but I do think that, at the level of federal decision-making, there are opportunities to make different choices with regard to infrastructure across the country, and also with regard to just kind of economic gaps in the country. And I'll use that very loosely, economic gaps.
Yeah, and in terms of politics, I also think it rises above that to me, because don't you also think that it calls us out as to who we are and what we were supposed to be and what we promised to be also? I mean, I don't understand how healthcare for people is a political idea. It just seems like a basic human right to me. So there is a part of me that just wonders how we got into the idea of political fights around things that are basic human needs.
Yeah, and the World Health Organization, of course, has certain indices of health at, where they understand them to be human rights. That's not a commitment that we've made in this country. And so, to get back to the kind of questions of ethics, ethics, philosophers think of ethics as a subset of what we call value theory, right? And I think that that's such interesting language. And I think it's important and accurate language. And I think that sometimes, at least in our political discourse, we think of some segments of the population as having values, and I guess other people as being valueless. I'm not sure what the other people are who aren't so-called values voters, but I think every decision that we make around distributive justice, in other words, how we're gonna spread out the stuff in society, is a reflection of what we value in this country as a nation. So, to the extent that whatever funds public, do or don't go to public education, right? That's saying something about what we think about investing in future generations.
You've written quite a bit online about racial disparity in end-of-life care, and two stories that you've written about. One I know is very close to home with what happened to your father, and the other one is a California teenager named Jahi McMarsh, who obviously both they have something in common, the way that they were treated in end-of-life care. You were there and witnessed what happened to your father, and wrote extensively about what happened to the teen. Can you talk about that specifically? Because obviously, I have been in situations where family members have died, and it's a tough thing to go through. You experienced something that I feel like you don't feel like your father was treated the way he could have. If you could tell those healthcare professionals what they should have done differently, what would you say?
Wow. What's funny is I've never thought about that question before. I've never, you would think, as I've written about it, I've spoken about it, I've never thought how to answer that question. Now, I will say the final hospital where my father was, he ended up in, I want to say something like 6 different hospitals across 2 states in a 3-month period. He was just going from place to place. So he ended up in Gainesville, Florida. And I will say he ended up in this long-term care hospital. That's where he eventually died. And there was a hospitalist named Dr. Wilson. And, I said, when I met him, I said, "Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson, but I'm not the kind of doctor who actually helps anyone. I'm a philosopher." And he had an infectious disease physician named Dr. Yancey. Now, those two physicians took very good care of my father at the end. And so when I say that there were issues, I certainly don't mean everyone. He was also, one of the last hospitals he was in was Shands Hospital, which is University of Florida's hospital. And he was there before they sent him to the long-term care hospital. He had a nurse named John, and I remember John because my daddy's name was John. And John was an excellent nurse. But I will say in general, when I got the call and I drove down to Florida, the thing that struck me, or the thing that I noticed, was that his pain was not being managed well. And that is literally how I found him. These are the kind of MapQuest days. So my father died in 2011. So we were still kind of using MapQuest a little bit. And so, I figured out where this hospital was from North Carolina, and I go through the doors, and, I stopped at the nurse's station to say, I'm looking for John Wilson, and I could hear him. I could actually hear him crying out in pain. And I said, never mind, I hear him. And that's literally how I found his room. I followed the sound. And so I think that around pain management, I think that I was deeply frustrated with that, because, on one level, and this turned out to be maybe that last 2 or 3 weeks of my father's life. So he was kind of in rough shape by then. I would have a physician tell me, well, he needs to be able to ask for medication, right? And at that point, my father was kind of in and out of consciousness, and he wasn't always lucid, partly because he'd been in the hospital since June or July, and at this point it was September. And he had a bit of what is colloquially referred to as ICU psychosis. So the kind of confusion that sets in, where days and nights start blending together when you've been in hospital for a long time. So there was that. And so on one hand, he needs to be able to ask for pain medicine. On the other hand, they didn't want to give him pain medicine because there were these concerns about addiction. And I found myself quite agitated in those moments. And what I realized that I had available to me, and I think that, in writing about the story, even with my own frustrations, I also realized that I had tools available to me. Here I am, this woman with a PhD in philosophy. And, as much as we like to think that, or I don't think all of us think that, but as much as some people at least like to think that, oh, once you go into the hospital, you're just treated like a patient and everything is fine. It mattered that I introduced myself as Dr. Wilson when I walked in that hospital.
Yeah.
It mattered on lots of reasons, even if I had been a white man coming in the hospital, but certainly as a Black woman coming into the hospital with my father, that I could say, I am Dr. Wilson. It mattered that I was working in bioethics, or I had just kind of started thinking in bioethics, and that at the time I was working at Duke University, and one of my colleagues was Alan Buchanan, who, as he says, which is actually true, wrote the book on surrogate decision-making. So it mattered that I could pick up the phone and call Alan Buchanan at home and say, Alan, this is what's happening with my daddy. What do I need to say to these people? And that, and that we could have conversations, and that I could use the exact language that he told me. And, I think part of the impetus for the book is that it shouldn't have to be that way in order to get decent care. And, as frustrated as I was, I also understood that I was in a better position than a whole lot of people are.
Yeah.
And then Jahai McMath, I'm sorry. I just kind of went on and on with that.
No.
Yeah, so Jahai McMath, her story really struck me, and there are a lot of complicated things happening in her case. It was a case of brain death. So she went in for a tonsillectomy, and I got in trouble. I was trying to simplify this for a public audience, and I said a routine tonsillectomy. And some people came after me like, no, she had her adenoids removed too. Like, yes, okay, I get that, but most people don't know or care what that means. But she did have some post-surgical complications, and the family at least thought that their concerns, or what they observed as excessive bleeding, wasn't taken as seriously by by healthcare personnel, and that by the time her needs were addressed, that she was declared brain dead. She experienced brain death. And so, the family had some skepticism around that diagnosis. And, some of that seems to have been grounded in religious sensibilities. I think some of that is also grounded in the fact that, at least to the extent that people think about brain death who work in healthcare professions, I don't think that there's been a great conversation or explanation to the public exactly what brain death entails. So some of that is a communication failure, some of that is kind of religious sensibility, some of that is just the shock of losing one's child. And so I just thought that there were places of intervention for healthcare systems with regard to that family and how they were treated and how they experienced, losing their child. And I'm not suggesting that someone who is brain dead, that there's anything to do to make them not brain dead. But I also think that there are ways to interact with patients and patients' families that leave people in the experience feeling respected and listened to and heard, and that also can shape one's perception. And so when you think more broadly about a kind of background and a history of medical mistrust, these kinds of incidents only serve to reinforce that.
And those seem like teachable moments to me too. That doesn't seem like something that we can't teach people how to do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about a couple of movements. One, Me Too. I read your fantastic article in the Conversation, Why Black Women's Experience of Me Too Are Different. And I wanted to just have you chat about the idea of why feminism might be looked at differently through the eyes of a Black woman, and how the Me Too movement should embrace that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting, with so much going on in the world, you don't hear a ton about Me Too anymore, although the issues have not gone away. The fundamental issues haven't gone away. One thing I will say about Black women generally in feminism is that, we were kind of in this mix and thinking about these issues from the beginning. So I think sometimes I'll get the criticism as someone who identifies as a feminist that, feminism is a white women's movement. And I say, well, no, actually it's not. Like, that's just historically false, but also in terms of just the intellectual work. But I will say one thing that, and I think even white feminists are seeing and understanding the kind of structural critiques that Black women and other women have made around issues of race and class and sexuality, and how those things intersect and how they shape how one experiences gender. And so I think that becomes a really important complication of feminism as just a set of goals that middle-class white women want to see promote their own ends. I think that if you think broadly about what it means for women to be free in society, then we have to think about the ways that class and race and region even shape how we think about ourselves as individuals, but also how we engage social structures and systems.
I would assume that Black lives, there's some intersection because of the order in which they happened. Obviously, with what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd and St. Louis with Breonna Taylor, the idea of safety and being able to even protest ideas has to come to play, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. You're at Howard University. What is your feeling about whether we should be hopeful that something can change here? Your school has produced a number of people who have been involved for decades in trying to change our viewpoint on race and Black culture. Do you feel hopeful? Should we feel hopeful? Is there something more we need to do? How do we get past this thing? How do we find some solace and hope here?
So one thing that does make me feel hopeful, I will say, is looking at how young people are thinking about racial justice, and not just Black young people. You know, part of Encore Public Voices, part of their mission is to foster these intergenerational connections. And I guess I'm in a space now where, you know, once upon a time, when I first went into the classroom, I didn't think of myself as being intergenerationally connected to my students, but I absolutely am. I mean, right? These are Gen Z kids and I'm a Gen Xer. Although the students don't really know what that means. They're like, are you a boomer? I'm like, how old do you think I am? But then because they're not quite sure, because they're like, okay, well, are you a millennial? I'm like, no, there's a whole generation of people in between these two things. Yeah, so I'm a Gen Xer, but yeah, so that is one thing that actually makes me hopeful, and to watch my students and the kinds of analyses that they offer. You know, they are way more sophisticated than I was in the 90s thinking about these issues. And so that gives me hope. Now, on the flip side of that, I'm also a 45-year-old Black woman. And there's a part of me that's just kind of, there's a part of me that's tired, you know, I'll just, you know, I can't say it any more elegantly than that. There's a part of me that's just tired. And so
I can imagine.
You know, I have these moments of ambivalence where, you know, the hope comes from watching people in their 20s and even in their 30s, and then just the kind of exasperation that I feel in my own kind of day-to-day life and work. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say leave it to the young people, because we also know they're young racists too. So, you know, I think sometimes there's this story that, oh, the youth will save us all. And I think that sometimes that narrative overlooks the fact that all segments of the population are replicating themselves. And so, you know, there has to be a continued vigilance to the extent that this is something that we all care about. And we can't just think, oh, all the young people are going to be not racist or less racist or anti-racist, or however we want to frame it.
And it seems to me like Encore's philosophy of that is right on target. And it just seems to me, I think there is a strong sense of hope in young people right now. But young people need to understand the history and the fights and the stories and the culture of the people who have come before them and the shoulders of those they stand on. So the idea of connecting people and finding ways to have people communicate those things seems incredibly important to me, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And to read and study and think about these things. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of aging, you mentioned being a Gen Xer. I mean, we were talking offline a week or two ago about, you know, I'm an early boomer, you're a Gen Xer, and at some point, not sure what any of this matters at all. It's like generationality to me seems kind of silly. Is there a difference in aging and generationality in the Black community? Do you see a need for a way to do things differently? That seems to me like the Black community has a pretty rich history of doing that naturally. Do we need to build on that? Are there things we need to fix, or is it something that is inherent in the culture?
Yeah, so, you know, I would of course say communities, because, you know, there are several kind of, you know, lots of different ways that folks experience Blackness and community. But so I'll say one thing just from the standpoint of health, since that's one of the things that I think about. You know, I said earlier that Black folks tend to live shorter, sicker lives, but part of what that does for one or to one is not just, right, it's not just a direct impact on an individual's lifespan. What that sometimes means, and I had this conversation a few weeks ago on a different podcast, is that sometimes responsibilities like caregiving responsibilities happen much sooner. And there are significant consequences for that over the course of one's life and career. So, you know, if you think of kind of white populations as entering significant caregiving responsibilities in their maybe 40s and 50s, and you're you know, you shave 10 years off of that, and you'll think about what that means to have to look after a parent or think about a parent in one's 30s, right? I mean, that's kind of prime career time. That's, you know, if you have small children, you know, that, so a lot of those things shift. And so a lot of the balls that one has to juggle shift a little bit, and what prime working life and prime working time looks like can get interrupted in ways that it's much more difficult to recover. I mean, think if you take on caregiving responsibilities in your 50s, you've kind of had an established career, you may be on the downslope of your career anyway, and that's going to have different consequences. And I don't mean that that's not important, but it is just, it's a difference. One thing, you know, again, another kind of health thing, and this kind of becomes a double-edged sword, what we're seeing, and I keep coming back to COVID because that's where we are. That's just where we are now. But one thing that epidemiologists are seeing in terms of spread is that Black communities, Latinx communities, those two in particular, are much more likely to live intergenerationally, which in some ways is very good. That means that you have, you know, grandma and grandpa right there, and, you know, maybe there's a kind of raising of the kids, and you have extended families, so you have parents and aunties and uncles and all of that around. But if you think about, you know, as we said earlier, only 20% of Black people, and I think it's something like 15% in Latinx communities, are even in a position to work from home. Now you're talking about people coming in and out of the house and potentially putting grandma and grandpa at risk, right? So again, you have this kind of sense of community and this close-knitness in a lot of instances. And, you know, that also becomes one of the spaces where communities become even more vulnerable. And some of the close-knitness is maybe just kind of cultural sensibilities about family and togetherness. Some of it happens out of necessity. You know, if you think about the kinds of, you know, especially if you live in a city, like an East Coast city, or live in California, the amount of money it takes to even live independently, even if you wanted to, is, you know, it is significant. And so, you know, some of this intergenerational living and connecting comes out of economic necessity, in addition to the kind of positive cultural sensibilities about it. So the story becomes really complicated.
And it seems like a self-professed cycle too, because if you put that burden on people younger and younger, that creates in and of itself healthcare disparity and healthcare outcomes that are much different, because caregiving, as we know, is unbearably hard, especially if you're sandwich generation for years and years longer with you know, young children and older adults at the same time. It's incredibly difficult. You mentioned, and then,
you know, of course, what that looks like when the caregiver retires, right? Now you've got this big chunk of work time that's missing, or income generating time that's missing. And so that impacts the resources, you know, that you have even to take care of yourself in old age, or, you know.
In terms of disparity and end of life, the monograph, Black Death, Racial Justice, Priority Setting, and Care at the End of Life, is this going to be a book? Are you writing a book? Are you publishing a book? Because this seems like it should be something that is out there, and I'm saying it out loud right now on this thing, and I'll help in any way possible. This seems like an incredibly important issue that people need to know more about. Thank
you. Yeah, you put that on out there into the universe, right? Just put it on.
I'm doing it right
now.
But
yes, this is a book project. This is a book project. So.
And what do you hope to do with that? What's your goal? What's your end goal in putting that out there?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to contribute to the conversation about, so priority setting is part of the subtitle. So priority setting is just kind of roughly the idea of how we distribute resources or how we make decisions about which resources matter the most. And so, I hope that I'm using end of life care, but I think that there are probably some general claims that could be made coming out of this text about, contributing to the conversation about what healthcare is going to look like and what kinds of choices we're going to make as a nation about whose health matters and under what circumstances, and where the, if not political will, the moral will is going to be with these issues as people age. I mean, I joke about, Gen Xers just being lost between the boomers and the millennials. And yes, Generation X is a very small generation, but the boomers are huge, right?
Yes.
The boomers are huge, right? So the youngest boomers are what, like mid 50s now? Yeah, because the oldest Gen Xers are like mid 50s. You've got a whole bunch of people getting ready to age into needing care. And, to be clear, my book about end of life isn't just about older people, particularly when we think about racial disparities, because Black people die across the lifespan at much earlier ages. But then, you have the Gen Xers trying to think through these issues, and then coming behind them, another huge generation of people. Millennials are huge. And so at some point, something's going to have to give.
And and again, like I said earlier, it just seems like those separations mean less and less. And being a late boomer, I apologize for us.
A young boomer.
It's hilarious. It's a generation of people. There's 70 million people, and people who are born in 1946 are a little bit different than people who are born in 1964. Let's face it.
Well, yeah, I mean that's true of all the, yeah.
I spoke at an
talking about a large number of people.
I think I told you this offline. I spoke at an AARP conference in Oregon a few years ago, and there were 4 speakers, and it just so happened that 2 of them were boomers and 2 of them were Gen Xers, and they had 2 little like love chair couches set up on the stage so that the speakers could sit next to each other and be relaxed and all that. And it just so happened that the boomers sat on one couch and the Gen Xers sat on another. We can't even get together on a stage at a conference.
On a couch. Yeah, and of course, these lines are just kind of heuristics, right? They give you a kind of rough snapshot. I have a dear friend, Jovan, who is a millennial, and I roll my eyes at, oh, you're such a millennial, but and she calls herself, and she's like, this is actually a thing. I'm an Xennial because I'm like an older millennial, and you and I have so much more in common. And because I'm a young Xer. And so I tease her about that all the time. I'm like, no. If you were a real Xer, you wouldn't need to call yourself something special. That's a very millennial trait.
or you guys are in between the specials.
That you can't just be a millennial. You have to be this Xennial to show that you are, so I tease her about that. But in some ways, as someone who's a little younger on the Xer spectrum, that there are things that I probably have in common with an older millennial that I don't necessarily have in common with say the oldest of the Gen Xers. So yeah, in lots of ways, these lines are kind of artificial, and we all know that as they point to kind of general trends.
So as a college professor, you're part of your job title is mentor to this younger generation of people. With the courses that you teach and the courses you want to teach going forward, what is it that you hope that these young people take away from it? And are there career paths in mind that you have, or is there a social change you have in mind? What's your dream sheet for the young people that you are guiding?
Mm-hmm. So, I tease my students, and I've done this for years. I say, I don't care what you think. I just want you to be able to think, right? You should not come through my philosophy class and not leave as one who can think critically, as one who can read, as one who can make an intelligent argument about something. I don't care what your job ends up being. There are lots of things that you can end up doing in the world, but if you don't know how to think critically, if you don't know how to engage the world, if you don't know how to engage others, then that's a problem. You have not shown yourself to be a rounded individual, and what's the point of you spending $50,000 a year to come to college if you're going to leave as dumb as you came? And so I can be kind of blunt sometimes with things. So, yeah, so I won't even say career paths or whatever as hopes. I want people who are engaged citizens of the world, who are engaged thinking and thoughtful citizens of the world. And whether you take my social and political class, whether you take feminist philosophy or philosophy of love and sex or intro to ethics, any of these things, I want you to be able to think about the world that you come from, the world that you're occupying, and the world that you actually want to see, and what you're willing to do to make that happen.
How do you think that the pandemic and COVID-19 and all of this is going to affect colleges going forward?
I don't know. I wish I had my crystal ball. In some ways, yeah, it's hard to predict to me. I think that we do see that some universities have handled having students on campus better than others. And I do think that going forward, universities are going to have to think seriously about what it looks like and what college life looks like, and what it means to be in person, and which kinds of things can happen using technology. And I also think, of course, we're seeing even the divide in technology. And so even at the college level, there are some students who have greater access to technology than others. And I think universities are going to have to take that seriously. It can't just be, we admitted you, now it's up to you to be successful. When we have these moments like this, I don't think that this is the last moment like this, whether it is something that impacts health, or whether it's a climate issue. I mean, you're in California. Half of California is on fire right now. What is that going to look like to go to UC Berkeley when everything around you is on fire? So, I do think universities are going to have to plan for these kinds of unexpected, but what should be unfortunately expected kinds of interruptions, and how to navigate them in ways that are particularly mindful of vulnerable students, particularly mindful of those who are in staff positions and aren't in a position to advocate for themselves, like housekeeping, like groundskeepers. You're really talking, especially in a pandemic, frontline type people being asked to do essentially infection control. And that's hard even in hospitals, right? That's a very specific skill. And to pay people $7 an hour and say, here's a mop and some gloves, figure it out. If we want universities to be just places, then that's going to have to, then thinking about that is going to have to matter. Also student athletes, right? Or students who are athletes. There are universities that closed or went online or sent students home, but the football players are still on campus. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, aren't they students? So, this is kind of getting us off the path a little bit, but I think there's going to have to be a reckoning with disentangling even athletic money and NCAA money from what it means to be a student.
Well, it's the intersection of commerce and safety and health too, where obviously the business of things like football, it's hard to stand in the way of something like that, but You know, there's also the health and safety risk piece of it that's an important thing. The other piece of being a mentor right now, I have my daughter is a junior in college, and it's a pretty scary time for college kids. You know, I went to school in the late 70s, early 80s, and you know, it was just a very, very different time. What do you tell kids these days? What do you teach kids these days to prepare them for going out into what might look right now like a pretty scary world out there?
I tell them that, you know, this is a space that we're all having to figure out together. And I know that that is not helpful or uplifting, and it's often not what the students want to hear, but you know, that's the reality that we're in. One thing that I'm really, that my students and I have conversations about quite often is student loan debt.
Yeah.
And the ways that will constrain their futures. And, you know, I say, you know, I don't mean to depress you, but while you're here and while you are still signing these documents telling Uncle Sam that you're going to pay them back, we also need to think about how this debt is going to constrain one's future. That doesn't mean go out and try to make a whole lot of money. There's not a whole lot of money to be made for the average person, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I see Kathy Trout. Yes, Howard, I think, is one of the institutions. There are other institutions that have eliminated SAT requirements. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and politically, obviously, that's a place where I think we have to start looking forward to, is that the amount of debt that we're saddling people with is embarrassing. It's a one-way trip to failure.
Yeah.
To have somebody walk out of college with a bachelor's degree and have $200,000 in debt is a tough way to go. Mm-hmm. So what's next for you? Yolonda Wilson, PhD, what's your next move?
Finishing this book has to be the next major move. After that, I'm open.
Very cool. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I thank you so much for being on Experience Talks, our Zoomcast here, and continued success in what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity, Tim.
It's great. It's been great to get to know you better. For the audience, I want to just let people know that our next show is going to be Tuesday, October 20th at 2 p.m. Pacific, and we'll have Maria Shriver on the show, former First Lady of California, talking about the women's Alzheimer's movement and her work as a journalist and her very interesting family. Her father started the Peace Corps and Special Olympics and stuff like that. So should be an interesting conversation. Yolonda, thank you very much again. It was great talking to you, and I hope to see you again soon when all of this lifts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.